welcome to M&A Corner. I'm pleased to continue my conversation with Stephen Amdur. And instead of talking about law and business and finance, what if we just talked about sports?
Love to talk about sports.
Turns out, though, that sports actually is a business, and a very big business at that.
Absolutely is.
I understand that you've basically developed one of the leading practices at Pillsbury for servicing that deal environment within the sporting universe. I would love just to hear how you became involved with that in the first place, because I'm sure that there are plenty of law students and business students who would like nothing more with their careers than to spend it in the sports area. And you found yourself there in your career. So how did that come about?
So we as a firm have actually had a long history representing teams and leagues in a number of different sports. And so it's been a really great place for us to be as we've seen the rise of private equity investments into sports teams and leagues. Given our work in private equity, given our work with sponsors, with interest in the space, it was a natural fit for us that as transactions continue to emerge, that we would receive those calls from our clients, from sponsors, from interested participants in the marketplace to understand what it means, what the rules are, how things are changing, how to negotiate and structure interests. All of the leagues in their own ways have effectively a regulatory oversight responsibility. And so it's not unlike doing a transaction in any other regulated industry. You have to understand the rules of the regulators, what they will and will not accept, and find a way to craft a transaction that both accomplishes the outside investors' needs, that provides the leagues with the certainty of their counterparties and their participants, because they do protect themselves, quite rightly from risky transactions as much as they can. And so certainly to your point, it's an attractive place for law students to go to have a bit more fun possibly on transactions, but it still requires the same level of rigor and diligence as any other deal.
And so if you actually take a look at a transaction and unpeel it and go behind the scenes, I assume that the legal documents, for instance, would look a lot like a corporate 100%. Deal document. And the financial analysis, which we would do and have done on behalf of our clients at Mizuho Greenhill in the space, look a lot like a valuation of a typical company, because ultimately that's what these businesses are, right? They are businesses at the end of the day.
100%. I think there's been some element of, especially when it comes to the minority stakes, of the rising valuations of leagues, the rising media rights that will ultimately lift up the individual team and league stakes, as well as the fact that, unlike many other businesses, there's almost always a cohort of interested buyers for the Knicks, for the Rangers. I mean, they're not for sale as far as I know. Given the scarcity these days of must-see TV, of events that really draw people away from TikTok and YouTube and Netflix and onto live television, the leagues and the teams are really capitalizing on that ability for rising valuations, greater opportunities to bring investors to the table and find ways to find good matches of teams that have a need for capital, whether it be because of long-term investors who are seeking liquidity or an opportunity for growth, and private equity investors who are looking for uncorrelated returns in a different industry that isn't necessarily tied in the same way to interest rates or debt financing or tariffs. The teams and leagues are accordingly finding really great synergies to bring it all together and find mutually beneficial relationships to build and grow.
One question for you, because a lot of these transactions tend to be minority rights transactions, where a financial sponsor or an institutional investor will come in and take a minority position in a particular team in a particular league. Do you have a sense of what the end game for that looks like? Is there just going to be a secondary market for these stakes that starts to develop over time? Is that the exit for these folks, or is it more of a permanent vehicle?
Many of the sponsors who have been approved to make these private equity minority investments in individual teams are structured at the fund level to have longer term hold periods. So it's not the typical 5 to 7 year period. It could be 7 to 10 or even potentially longer. The teams and leagues obviously need that, because nobody wants to be in a position of a forced liquidity sale, a forced total exit for the teams, especially at a time where things are potentially not at their best, or there are other reasons why it's just not a good marketplace for a sale. But what we're also seeing, obviously, is investors who come in at the right time and the right team can capitalize pretty tremendously on a total team sale event. And we've seen a few of those, and some investors have made out very well. I suspect in the long run, because we're still pretty new with this, that you will start to see that secondary market develop, either with the individual teams buying back those stakes, with private equity investors coming in to take stakes that have matured a bit since the original investment, or just as has always been the case, interested wealthy individuals with a passion for the team and the locality have an interest in coming in and taking the stake.
Yeah. And you're a lifelong Yankees fan?
Yankees, Knicks, Rangers, Giants.
And your last transaction in the sector was for the San Francisco...
Well, they once were the New York Giants, so it counts.
Okay. But it's a testament to you as a lawyer that you're able to put those biases aside and represent your client 100% to the fullest.
Zealous representation of the client, no matter who they are.
Can I ask you about the international market? Because it almost feels like this might have started in the UK with some of the soccer/football franchises, depending on what part of the world you're from. Is that really the genesis of what's happened, and it's then come over to the States?
I think actually it's been a bit more the other way around. You did certainly see a number of the sovereign wealth funds taking stakes, large stakes, controlling stakes in a number of teams throughout European football. But most of those were, again, full control stakes as opposed to minority stakes. I think we've been starting to see some of the U.S. investment groups take more of an interest in finding the right opportunities in those European football clubs for a minority stake and opportunity. And I suspect that will continue.
Can we talk a little bit about college sports? And
Sure.
Maybe I'm slightly biased here, but I am a huge fan of the Michigan Wolverines and Big Ten football as a whole, and clearly drives an enormous amount of activity from people watching on Saturday afternoons, and if you're so lucky, into January with the playoffs. How do you see this translate, the activity that we're seeing at the professional level down to the university level, which is very, very large in and of itself?
I think similarly, you've got situations where people are looking for opportunities to grow and compete. You obviously don't have the same level of liquidity seeking that you might have at the professional level, but college sports has become ultra competitive in terms of financial capabilities to recruit and retain the best talent, both at the coaching level and the player level. Similarly, people are looking to build bigger and better stadiums and facilities to attract players. And conferences are looking to position themselves as the most desirable conferences for individual schools. All of those requirements are things that require capital. I think most of the private equity investment is going to be around things like media rights, which have obviously longer-term predictable cash flows that can be built in and bought into in a way that people can be more confident about, as opposed to some other areas which still seem to be under a dynamic level of regulatory and legislative review.
Yeah. I mean, these schools really, at the end of the day, not only are they businesses, they're also brands. I mean, you have a very prominent brand in the University of Michigan, and so there's going to be different valuations and different outcomes as a result of those kind of distinctions that I'm sure the marketplace will sort through. It is interesting how the space is evolving and maturing, and we found ourselves representing clients as well in terms of not only the advisory side of what they should be doing, but also the financial aspect of supporting people who do want to make investments into these teams, which tend to come at high valuations and large check sizes. But the firm as a whole is standing behind that practice, and with a Japanese parent, certainly would love to invest in baseball. Stephen, I'd like to thank you for joining us
It's my pleasure.
today. I'm going to go out on a limb and say that was one of our most, if not the most interesting conversation we've had on M&A Corner, if for no other reason, the fact that we could talk about sports
There you go.
in the context of law and finance where we both spend our time. So thank you again for joining.
It was an absolute pleasure. Thank you, Kevin.